History is a heavy blanket. It covers the truth to keep us comfortable. We like simple stories. We like names we can remember. We like dates we can memorize. October 12th, 1492. Christopher Columbus, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. For generations, this was the start button of America. We were told the ocean was an empty void. We were told the world was flat in the minds of men. But the soil does not lie. The DNA does not forget. The stars have seen sailors that history tried to erase. America was never a secret. It was a destination. It was a home for millions long before Spain existed. Columbus did not discover America. He was just the last person to find it. He stumbled into a crowded room. He was late to a very old party. Let us travel north. Leave the warm sun of the Caribbean. Forget the palm trees. Go to the edge of the world, to the cold gray coast of Newfoundland. The year is 985 AD, half a millennium before Columbus was born. The North Atlantic is a graveyard. It is a place of ice and fog. A man named Bjarni Herjolfsson is on a ship. He's a merchant. He's looking for his father in Greenland. But a storm rises. The wind screams like a ghost. For days he is lost in the mist. When the sky clears, he sees something he cannot explain. He sees a land covered in trees. He sees rolling hills of green. This is not Greenland. Greenland is white and jagged. This land is alive. Bjarni is afraid. He does not land. He turns his ship away. He finds his way to Greenland, but he tells the story. In the Viking world, stories of wood are better than gold. Greenland had no trees. Greenland had no timber for ships. The seeds of curiosity were planted. Enter Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, a man built of muscle and salt. He hears Bjarni's story. He does not want to just look at the land. He wants to touch it. He buys Bjarni's ship. He recruits 35 men. He sets sail into the unknown. He follows the stars. He watches the flight of the birds. First, he finds a land of stone. He calls it Helgeland. We know it today as Baffin Island. He sails south. He finds a land of white sand and forests. He calls it Markland. We know it today as Labrador. Then he finds the miracle, a place where the salmon are larger than any in Norway, a place where the grapes grow wild. He calls it Vinland, the land of wine. For 1,000 years, the world laughed at this. The sagas are just poems, the scholars said. Vikings in America is a fairy tale, the professors said. They were wrong. In 1960, a man named Helge Ingstad arrived in a small village, Los Omeros. He was looking for the truth. A local fisherman showed him a group of mounds. They looked like old sod houses. Helge and his wife Anstein began to dig. They didn't find stone tools. They found a bronze pin. It was a cloak pin in the exact style of the Norse. They found a spindle whorl used for spinning wool. And they found a smithy, a place where iron was forged. The indigenous people of Newfoundland did not smelt iron. The Vikings did. The fairy tale was real. The Vikings were the first Europeans to build a home in America. They stayed for years. They had a child named Snorri, the first European child born on this soil. But why did they leave? Why is our language English and Spanish and not Old Norse? The answer is hidden in the blood and in the silence of the North Atlantic. The Viking Shadow and the First Blood. The ruins at Los Omeros tell a story of arrival. But they also tell a story of a sudden, quiet departure. Why did the Vikings leave? They had iron. They had the best ships in the world. They had found a land of grapes and endless timber. To understand the end of Vinland, we must look at the sagas, specifically the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. They speak of a people they called the Skraelings. This was the Norse word for the indigenous people of North America, the First Nations, the true owners of the soil. The meeting was not like the movies. It was not a war on the first day. It was a nervous silence. The Norse offered milk and red cloth. The indigenous people offered furs and skins. Two worlds, two different ways of life, meeting on a beach in Newfoundland, separated by thousands of years of different history. But peace is a fragile thing. In the sagas, they tell of a single moment that changed everything: a bull. The Vikings had brought livestock on their ships. A great black bull escaped from the Norse camp. It ran toward the indigenous traders, roaring. The local people had never seen such a beast. To them, it was a monster from a nightmare. They fled into the woods. 3 days later, they returned, but they did not come to trade. They came with weapons. They came in skin boats that covered the water like a swarm. The Vikings fought back. They had iron swords and steel axes, but they were a handful of men, and the land was full of defenders. Leif's sister, Freydis, is said to have saved the camp. She was a woman of terrifying courage. When the Norse men began to retreat, she stood her ground. She grabbed a sword. She struck her own chest with the flat of the blade. She screamed a war cry that chilled the blood. The attackers paused. They had never seen such defiance. The Vikings survived the day, but they realized the truth. The land was rich, but the cost of staying would be a river of blood. They were too far from home. There were no reinforcements coming from Norway, no ships from the king. They were alone at the edge of the universe. They packed their homes. They burned what they could not carry. They sailed back into the gray fog of the Atlantic. Vinland became a memory, a ghost story told in the longhouses of Greenland. But did they really stop going? The history books say the Vikings disappeared from America in the year 1010 AD, but the soil suggests otherwise. In 1957, a coin was found in Maine, a silver penny. It was buried in a site belonging to the Penobscot people. For years, it was called a fake, but experts analyzed it. It was a genuine Norse coin, minted in Norway between 1065 and 1080. That is 70 years after the Vikings supposedly left. How did a Norwegian coin get to Maine? It tells us that the trade didn't stop. Viking ships kept coming. They didn't come to conquer anymore. They came to trade. They came for the Markland timber. They were the secret visitors of the North Coast. For 400 years, they maintained a hidden connection. But while the Vikings were looking for wood in the north, something else was happening in the south. A different group of sailors was moving, and they were crossing an ocean that makes the Atlantic look like a pond. Chapter 3: The Star Path, the Polynesian Challenge. Turn your gaze away from the ice. Look at the Pacific. It is the largest single feature on our planet. If you took all the land on Earth and dropped it into the Pacific, there would still be room for another Africa. For centuries, European mapmakers drew this ocean as an empty void. They believed no one could cross it. They believed it was a wall of death. But they were looking at the world through small windows. The Polynesians did not see a wall. They saw a garden. They saw a map written in the stars. They saw a world of islands waiting to be found. They were the greatest explorers the human race has ever produced, and they found America long before the Europeans knew it existed. Imagine a double-hulled canoe. It is built of wood and woven fibers. It has no metal. It has no nails. It's held together by rope and prayer. And it is crossing 5,000 miles of open water. How? The European explorers used the sextant and the compass. The Polynesians used the universe. A navigator would sit on the deck for 20 hours a day. He would feel the vibration of the hull. He could tell by the way the ship rocked if there was an island 100 miles away. He knew that islands create interference in the waves. He watched the stars rise and set. He knew the star path for every destination. He watched the clouds. A faint green glow on the underside of a cloud meant a lagoon was below the horizon. He watched the birds, the terns, the boobies, the frigate birds. He knew their flight paths. He knew when they were fishing and when they were flying home to land. This was a science, a deep, spiritual, mathematical science, passed down from father to son for 3,000 years, and it led them to the shores of the New World. For a long time, Western science laughed at this. They were just lost fishermen, the critics said. They drifted there by accident, the scholars said. But you don't drift 5,000 miles and find a specific coast. You don't drift and then bring back a plant. Let us talk about the sweet potato, the Ipomoea batatas. It is a humble vegetable, but it is the key to a global mystery. It is native to the Andes Mountains in South America. It cannot grow in the wild on a Pacific island. The seeds cannot survive the salt water. The tubers rot in the sea. Yet when the first Europeans arrived in Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, the people were eating sweet potatoes. They had been eating them for centuries. In the Quechua language of Peru, the word for sweet potato is kumar. In the islands of Polynesia, the word is kumara. It is the same word. It is the same plant. In 2020, the DNA confirmed the impossible. Polynesian sailors reached South America around the year 1200. They landed in what is now Colombia or Ecuador. They traded their chickens for the sweet potato. They brought the plant back to the islands. They changed the diet of a hemisphere. They were the masters of the Pacific, and America was just another island in their great blue world. While the North was haunted by Viking ghosts and the South was fueled by Polynesian courage, another story was brewing in the heat of West Africa, a story of a king who gave up everything for the horizon. The year is 1111, 81 years before the Santa Maria was even a dream. The Empire of Mali is the crown of the world. It is a land of scholars, a land of libraries, and more gold than any European king could imagine. The ruler is Mansa Abu Bakr II, but he is not interested in his throne. He is obsessed with the limitless ocean. He wants to know if the Atlantic has a shore. The Arab historian Al-Umari recorded the king's words. Abu Bakr did not believe the ocean was empty. He believed it was a road. He commissioned an expedition of 200 ships. He filled them with gold, water, and dried meat. He told his captains, "Do not return until you reach the end of the ocean." Only one ship returned. The captain spoke of a river in the sea, a current so strong it swept the fleet away into the deep. Abu Bakr did not see this as a warning. He saw it as proof. He did not want to wait for reports. He wanted to see it himself. He abdicated his throne. He gave the crown to his brother, the famous Mansa Musa. He built a new fleet, 2,000 ships, 1,000 for his men, 1,000 for supplies. He sailed west into the setting sun, and he never returned to Africa. For centuries, this was called a king's madness, a suicide mission, but the evidence suggests a different ending.
When the Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he was confused. He found indigenous people in Hispaniola who told him of black traders. They spoke of people who came from the south and the east. They traded spears tipped with a specific gold alloy. The Spanish called it guanine. Columbus took samples of this gold back to Spain. Metallurgists analyzed the chemical signature. It was 18 parts gold, 6 parts silver, 8 parts copper. It was the exact same ratio used in the gold mines of medieval Mali. Coincidence? Or did Abu Bakr's 2,000 ships catch the Atlantic current, a current that flows like a conveyor belt from Africa to Brazil? A ship doesn't even need to sail to reach America from Mali. It just needs to stay afloat. The king didn't go to his death. He went to his destiny.
But let us move east, to the forbidden city of China. The year is 1421, the Ming Dynasty. While Europe is fighting tribal wars, China is building a navy that will not be matched for 400 years. The admiral is Zheng He. He is a giant of a man, a warrior, a eunuch, a diplomat. He leads a fleet of treasure ships. They are 400 feet long. They have 9 masts and 12 sails. One single Chinese ship could hold all 3 of Columbus's ships on its deck and still have room for a garden. They traveled to Africa. They traveled to the Middle East. But did they cross the Great Blue Void? Gavin Menzies, a former British submarine commander, sparked a fire in 2002. He presented a map, the 1418 map. It shows the continents of the world with shocking accuracy. It shows the curves of North America. It shows the rivers of South America. The map says it is a copy of an original from 1418. If it is real, it means the Chinese had mapped the New World 70 years before Columbus. The evidence is hidden in the silt. On the coast of California, divers found round stones, stone anchors with holes bored through the center. They are made of a specific type of rock, a rock found in the quarries of southern China. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous tribes have legends of red-sailed ships, ships that brought people who taught them how to weave different patterns. In their DNA, there is a marker found only in the Han Chinese and the people of the Pacific coast. Why is this not in our textbooks? Because in 1433, China changed its mind. The emperor died. The new rulers were afraid of the world. They believed China was the center of the universe and needed nothing from the outside. They recalled the fleet. They burned the ships. They burned the logs. They made it a crime to build a ship with more than 2 masts. They chose to be a fortress instead of an empire. Zheng He's maps were turned to ash. His discoveries were deleted from the imperial records. But you cannot burn the DNA. You cannot burn the stone anchors in the California mud. The dragon reached the shore. It looked at America, and it decided to go home. The Ice Bridge and the First Footsteps. We have spoken of kings. We have spoken of admirals and Vikings, but they were all late. Even the Vikings, arriving 1,000 years ago, were newcomers. To find the true discoverers, we must peel back the layers of time itself. We must go back before the written word, before the wheel, back to a world gripped by ice. The year is 23,000 BC. The world is a different place. Massive glaciers, miles thick, swallow the northern hemisphere. The oceans are lower because the water is trapped in ice. For a century, scientists gave us a simple answer, the Clovis First theory. They said that 13,000 years ago, a corridor opened in the ice, a land bridge called Beringia. They said hunters followed the woolly mammoth from Siberia into Alaska. It was a clean story. It was an easy story. But the Earth was hiding a secret that would shatter it. In 2021, in the white sands of New Mexico, the ground opened up. Archaeologists found footprints, ghost tracks.
They only appear when the moisture in the soil is exactly right. Then they vanish again. But these weren't mammoth tracks. They were human. The tracks of children jumping in puddles, the tracks of a mother carrying a heavy load. Scientists tested the ancient seeds embedded in those footprints. The results sent a shockwave through the world of history. 23,000 years old. At that time, the ice sheets were solid. The land bridge was blocked by a wall of ice 2 miles high. There was no way to walk from Siberia to New Mexico, and yet there they were, playing, hunting, living. If they didn't walk through the ice, how did they get here? The answer lies in the kelp highway. Imagine a people who did not fear the ocean. They lived in small boats made of animal skins and bone. They didn't wait for the ice to melt. They sailed around it. They followed the coastline from Asia down through Alaska, all the way to South America. They lived off the sea. They ate fish, seals, and kelp. They moved silently along the edge of the frozen world. While the rest of humanity was huddled in caves in Europe, these explorers were claiming a continent. They were the first to see the Grand Canyon, the first to climb the Andes. They were the original Americans.
But there is another theory, one that is whispered in the halls of the Smithsonian, the Solutrean hypothesis. It suggests that some of the first Americans didn't come from the West. They came from the East, from Europe. Archaeologists found stone tools in Virginia and Maryland. They are called Cactus Hill points. They are not like the tools found in Siberia, but they are identical to tools found in France and Spain from 20,000 years ago, the Solutrean people. It suggests that ancient Europeans may have crossed the Atlantic, not in large ships, but by hugging the edge of the great Atlantic ice pack. They followed the seals that used the ice as a floating bridge. If this is true, the first European discovery of America wasn't Columbus. It wasn't even the Vikings. It was a forgotten tribe of Ice Age hunters 20,000 years ago. We look at the ocean and we see a barrier. We see a blue wall that keeps us apart. But our ancestors saw something else. They saw a challenge. They saw a road. From the skin boats of the Ice Age to the long ships of the North to the treasure fleets of the East, the story of America is a story of arrivals. It is a story of a land that was never truly isolated. The footprints in the New Mexico mud are a message. They tell us that we have always been explorers. We have always been searching for the next horizon. And the man we call the discoverer was just one of the many who found their way home. As we move forward in time, the mystery does not fade, it deepens. We have looked at the ice and the stars. Now we must look at the red dust of the American Southwest. In 1909, a headline appeared in the Arizona Gazette. It spoke of a discovery that should not exist. An explorer named G.E. Kincaid was rafting down the Colorado River. In the heart of the Grand Canyon, he claimed to find a citadel, a series of tunnels carved deep into the canyon wall. Inside, he described seeing massive halls. He spoke of statues that looked like the Buddha. He spoke of copper tools. And most shocking of all, he described tablets covered in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The story was quickly silenced. The Smithsonian Institution denied any knowledge of the site. The area where Kincaid supposedly found the cave is now off-limits. It is a restricted zone in a national park. Why? Mainstream history tells us the Egyptians never left the Mediterranean. They were desert people, not ocean voyagers. But is that true? We know the Egyptians had cedar ships. We know they were obsessed with the afterlife and the land of the West. In the 1990s, a German scientist named Svetlana Balabanova made a discovery. She was testing the mummies of Egyptian kings. She found traces of nicotine and cocaine in their tissues. This created a scandal in the scientific world.
Tobacco and coca are plants native only to the Americas. They did not exist in Africa or Europe 3,000 years ago. There is no accidental way for these chemicals to enter an Egyptian lung, unless there was a trade route, unless the ships of the pharaohs were crossing the Atlantic, searching for the sacred plants of the gods. Hidden in the deepest cracks of the Grand Canyon, the answer might still be waiting. But the desert is not the only place with secrets. Let us travel to the bottom of the sea, the Bay of Jars, off the coast of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. In the 1980s, divers found a treasure that was not gold. They found hundreds of amphoras. These are tall clay jars with two handles. They were the shipping containers of the ancient world, and they were uniquely Roman. The style was identical to jars produced in Morocco in the 2nd century AD. Romans were not supposed to be in Brazil. Their ships were built for the Mediterranean, not the Atlantic swells. But a Roman ship caught in a storm off the coast of Africa would be pushed by the trade winds. It would be forced to cross the ocean. If they survived the crossing, they would land in South America. The Bay of Jars suggests they did. They wrecked, they survived, and perhaps they lived out their lives among the local tribes, leaving behind only their clay jars and a memory of men in iron.
There is more. In a small museum in Mexico, there is the Tecacic Calestrawa head. It is a small terracotta head found in a burial site. It was buried long before the Spanish arrived, but the style is unmistakably Roman. The beard, the features, the clay. Art historians agree it was made in 2nd century Rome. How did a Roman head end up in a Mexican grave? History is a puzzle where half the pieces have been thrown away. We are told that Columbus was the first contact, but the soil of Brazil and the graves of Mexico tell a different story. They tell of accidental explorers, men who were lost at sea and found a new world. Men who didn't come to conquer, they came because the wind gave them no choice.
We think we know our past. We think the timeline is set in stone. But every time we dig, the timeline stretches. The Egyptians in the canyon, the Romans in the bay, the Greeks in the DNA of the North. The ocean was not a wall, it was a filter. Only the bravest or the most unlucky made it through, and they were all here, waiting for the discovery that would happen thousands of years later. We have looked at the visitors, the Vikings, the Polynesians, the Romans, but we must stop looking at America as an empty stage. We must look at the giants who were already here. Because while Europe was struggling through the Middle Ages, a massive civilization was rising in the heart of the American Midwest. A city called Cahokia, located near modern-day St. Louis. At its peak, in the year 1100 AD, Cahokia was larger than London. It was larger than Paris. It was a city of 20,000 people. And at the center of this city stood Monk's Mound, a massive pyramid of earth, 100 feet high, covering 14 acres. It contains over 20 million cubic feet of soil, all of it carried, basket by hand. Cahokia was not a primitive camp. It was an urban marvel. It had a central plaza, it had suburbs, it had a woodhenge, a series of cedar posts arranged in a perfect circle. It acted as a celestial calendar. It tracked the summer and winter solstices with precision. These people were not savages wandering the woods. They were engineers, they were astronomers, they were the masters of the Mississippi. And they were connected to a vast trade network. Archaeologists found shells from the Gulf of Mexico. They found copper from the Great Lakes.
They found mica from the Appalachian Mountains. The Americas were a web of commerce and culture, long before a single European sail appeared on the horizon. But go further east to the rolling hills of Ohio. Here we find the Great Serpent Mound. It is the largest earthwork in the world, 1,300 feet long. It depicts a snake winding through the landscape. Its mouth is open, about to swallow an egg. But there is a mystery in the snake's curves. When viewed from above, the serpent's body aligns with the heavens. The head points toward the summer solstice sunset. The coils align with the moon's cycles. Who built this? Why did they create a masterpiece that can only be fully seen from the sky? We call them the mound builders, but we do not know their true names. They left no written records, only their monumental shapes in the earth. Some believe they were connected to the Mayans of the south. Others believe they were a civilization that was destroyed by a cataclysm we have forgotten. And then there is the mystery of the Copper Kings. Around Lake Superior, there are thousands of ancient mine pits. Thousands of years ago, someone mined 500 million pounds of copper. It was a massive industrial operation. But the copper didn't stay in America. Vast amounts of it simply disappeared. Where did it go? Some unconventional historians point to the Bronze Age in Europe. The Bronze Age was fueled by copper and tin. Europe had plenty of tin, but copper was scarce. Could it be? Could ancient Bronze Age ships have crossed the Atlantic to mine the Great Lakes? Could the Old World have been fueled by the New World's metal? We find copper artifacts in the mounds of Ohio, but we also find Old World markers in the genetics of the people who lived there. The X haplogroup, a DNA marker common in the Middle East and Europe, but found in high concentrations among the ancient Algonquian people. It is a bridge in the blood, a bridge that suggests the ocean was never a wall, it was a revolving door. We are taught that America was a wilderness, that it was a vacant land waiting for civilization. But the mounds tell a different story. The copper mines tell a different story. Cahokia tells a different story. The land was already civilized. It was already built. It was already ancient. Columbus didn't bring civilization to the Americas. He brought a different kind of civilization, one that would eventually bury the mounds under the weight of a new myth.
The Knights of the North and the Stone Riddles. We move our journey to the rugged forests of New England, specifically to a place in New Hampshire called Mystery Hill. Today, it is known as America's Stonehenge. It is a sprawling complex of stone chambers, walls that stretch for miles, and massive monoliths aligned with the stars. Mainstream history says these were built by 18th century farmers, root cellars for potatoes. But farmers do not align their potato cellars with the winter solstice. They do not build drainage systems that resemble ancient Phoenician designs, and they do not leave behind stone tablets with Ogham script, an ancient Irish alphabet. Carbon dating of the charcoal found at the site tells a different story. 4,000 years. This site was active long before the first Puritan stepped off the Mayflower. It suggests that Celtic explorers, or perhaps Bronze Age mariners, found the granite shores of the Northeast. They built observatories, they carved their prayers into the stone, and then, like so many others, they faded into the woods. But they were not the only ones from the British Isles who heard the call of the West. Let us travel to the year 1398. Nearly a century before Columbus. The story centers on Henry Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney, a man with Viking blood and the secrets of the Knights Templar. According to the Zeno narrative, Sinclair sailed west with a fleet of 12 ships. He was guided by a Venetian navigator.
The legends say he landed in Nova Scotia. In a place called Castle Canning, there are ruins that do not fit the local architecture. And in the town of Westford, Massachusetts, there is a strange carving on a rock, the Westford Knight. It depicts a life-sized figure of a 14th century knight. He carries a shield. He holds a sword. The hilt of the sword is distinctively European. The armor is not indigenous. Is it a hoax? Or is it a tombstone for a soldier who died thousands of miles from his castle? The Templar connection goes deeper. In the Roslin Chapel in Scotland, built in the mid-1400s, there are stone carvings. They depict plants that did not exist in Europe at the time: Indian corn and aloe cacti. Both are native to the Americas. How did a stone carver in a quiet Scottish village know what American corn looked like in 1450? The answer is simple yet revolutionary. The Templars knew. They had the ships, they had the maps, and after they were hunted by the King of France, they needed a place to hide, a place beyond the reach of the Pope, a place they called the New Jerusalem. They didn't discover America, they used it as a sanctuary.
There is a recurring theme in all these stories. Whether it is the Templars, the Celts, or the Phoenicians, they all left stones. In Minnesota, there is the Kensington Rune Stone, found by a farmer in 1898, tangled in the roots of a tree. It is covered in Viking runes. It tells a chilling story of an expedition in the year 1362, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on a voyage of discovery. It speaks of a massacre, found 10 men red with blood and dead. It ends with a prayer, AVM, save us from evil. For a century, it was called a fraud, but new microscopic analysis shows the weathering of the runes is consistent with hundreds of years in the soil. If it is real, it means the Vikings were in the heart of Minnesota, while the Aztecs were still building their empire in Mexico. We look for ships, we look for gold, but we should be looking at the rocks. The stones are the memories of the earth. They don't have a political agenda. They don't care about the fame of Columbus. They simply sit in the forests of Massachusetts and the fields of Minnesota, waiting for us to read the history we were never supposed to know.
The Tower of Silence and the Minnesota Mystery. If the Knights Templar or the Norse explorers truly stayed, they would have left more than just carvings. They would have built structures, monuments to stand against the wind of time. And in Newport, Rhode Island, one such monument still stands, the Newport Tower. It is a circular stone tower built on 8 pillars. Mainstream history calls it a windmill. They say it was built by a colonial governor in the 1600s. But windmills do not have sacred geometry. Windmills do not have windows that align perfectly with the sunset of the winter solstice. And windmills are not built with the Scottish ell, a unit of measurement used in medieval Europe. Archaeologists have found something strange in the mortar. Carbon dating suggests the tower was standing long before the pilgrims arrived. Its design is hauntingly similar to the round churches of the Knights Templar in Scandinavia. Was this a watchtower? A lighthouse for a fleet that never came home? Or was it a church built by a small group of Norse-Scottish explorers trying to bring the architecture of their god to the forests of the New World? The tower remains a silent witness. It does not speak, but its shadow falls across the landscape like a question mark. But the mystery moves further inland, far from the salt spray of the Atlantic, to the frozen heart of the American Midwest, Kensington, Minnesota. The year is 1898. A Swedish immigrant named Olof Oman is clearing his land. He pulls a stump from the ground. Tangled in the roots of a poplar tree is a slab of gray stone.
It is covered in carvings. They are not English. They are not indigenous. They are runes. The Kensington Runestone. The message carved into the stone is a tragedy in 3 acts. 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on a voyage of exploration. The year is 1362. It tells of a journey from Vinland to the west. It says they returned to their camp and found 10 of their men red with blood and dead. It ends with a plea for mercy. AVM, save us from evil. For 100 years, this was the most hated object in American archaeology. It is a hoax, the professors cried. Oman carved it himself, the newspapers said. They pointed to the grammar. They said the runes were too modern. But the stone had a secret. In the 2000s, a geologist named Scott Wolter put the stone under the microscope. He looked at the individual carvings. He looked at the weathering of the crystals inside the cuts. His conclusion was explosive. The carvings were not 100 years old. They were hundreds of years old. They had been in the ground for a long, long time. And the modern runes? They were discovered to be a rare form of Dalecarlian runes, runes used only by a specific group of people in Sweden in the 14th century. A secret alphabet that Olaf Oman, a simple farmer, could not have known. If the stone is real, it means that in the year 1362, a combined group of Swedish and Norwegian explorers was in the middle of America. They had sailed into Hudson Bay. They had traveled down the Red River. They were 1,500 miles from the ocean. They were deep in the interior, decades after the Vikings supposedly vanished. They were not discovering a world. They were running for their lives. They were an expedition that met a violent end, and their only legacy was a single stone left in the roots of a tree for a farmer to find 5 centuries later. We think of history as a straight line, but the Newport Tower and the Kensington Stone tell us it is a tangled web. People didn't just arrive once. They arrived, they lived, they died, and they were forgotten, until the ground decides it is time to reveal the truth. The Midwest was not a wilderness waiting for the mapmakers. It was already a graveyard for the explorers who came before.
The Map of the Impossible and the Antarctic Ghost. We have looked at the stones on the ground. Now we must look at the ink on the parchment. The year is 1513. In the city of Constantinople, a Turkish admiral named P.D. Reis completes a map. Reis was a legendary sailor, but he was also a scholar. He admitted that he did not draw this map from his own eyes. He said it was a compilation, a puzzle put together from 20 different source maps. Some of these source maps, he claimed, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. When historians first looked at the P.D. Reis map, they were stunned. It showed the coast of South America with startling accuracy, but then they looked lower. At the bottom of the map, there is a landmass. It is connected to the tip of South America. It looks like the coast of Antarctica. This should be impossible. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. That is 300 years after P.D. Reis drew his map. But the mystery goes even deeper. In the 1950s, the map was sent to the U.S. Air Force. They compared the P.D. Reis map to modern seismic scans of the Antarctic continent. Their conclusion was chilling. The map does not show Antarctica as it looks today. It shows Antarctica without the ice. It depicts the mountains, the valleys, and the bays of a landmass that has been buried under a mile of frozen water for at least 6,000 years. How could an admiral in 1513 have access to a map of an ice-free Antarctica? It suggests that someone was mapping the globe before the glaciers arrived, someone with a high level of mathematical skill, someone who understood longitude, a concept that the Europeans wouldn't master for centuries.
If Piri Reis had these maps, it means there was a mother culture, a forgotten civilization of mariners. They didn't just find America, they knew the entire world, and they left their charts in the ancient libraries of the Greeks, the Arabs, and eventually the Spanish to find them. Columbus wasn't sailing into the unknown, he was sailing with a copy of an ancient secret. But let us follow the maps to a different shore, the coast of Brazil. We are taught that the Portuguese found Brazil in the year 1500, but look at the Treaty of Tordesillas. The year is 1494. Spain and Portugal were fighting over the New World. They asked the Pope to draw a line down the middle of the Atlantic. Everything to the west of the line belonged to Spain. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. But the Portuguese king did something strange. He insisted that the line be moved further west. He fought for it. He wouldn't sign the treaty until the line was shifted 370 leagues from the Cape Verde Islands. Why? If you shift the line to that exact spot, it happens to include the coast of Brazil. This was 6 years before the official discovery of Brazil. The Portuguese king wasn't guessing. He was protecting an asset he already knew existed. Secret Portuguese voyages had likely charted the Brazilian coast in the 1470s. They kept it a state secret. In that era, maps were more valuable than gold. If you found a new land, you didn't tell the world. You hid the maps. You killed anyone who tried to steal them. The discovery of 1500 was a staged event, a public announcement of a secret that the sailors had known for decades. We think of the Age of Discovery as a time of wonder and light, but it was a time of shadows and spies. It was a war of information, and the most important pieces of information were the ancient maps, the charts that showed the way to the land of the West, the maps that showed an Antarctica that had long ago turned to ice. Columbus was the public face of a private heist. He took the credit for a world that had already been mapped by people whose names have been erased from the ink of time.
The Pharaoh's Secret and the Silk Road of the Sea. We have looked at the maps of the Turks. We have looked at the secrets of the Portuguese. But now we must look at the bodies of the gods. We must return to the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. In 1992, a German toxicologist named Svetlana Balabanova performed a routine test. She was examining the remains of Henut Tawi, a priestess who lived 3,000 years ago. She wasn't looking for a mystery. She was looking for traces of ancient medicine. What she found instead was a scientific earthquake. Inside the tissues of the mummy, she found high concentrations of nicotine and cocaine. This should have been impossible. The tobacco plant is native to the Americas. The coca plant grows only in the Andes of South America. Neither of these plants existed in the Old World during the time of the pharaohs. Mainstream historians were furious. "Contamination," they cried. The mummies were handled by Victorian explorers who smoked pipes. But Balabanova did not back down. She tested the hair bulbs. She tested the internal organs. The chemicals were not on the skin. They were inside the body. They had been ingested while the priestess was alive. Since that discovery, hundreds of other Egyptian mummies have been tested. The results are consistent. Tobacco and cocaine were present in ancient Egypt. If the plants were in Egypt, they had to cross the water, and not just any water, the entire Atlantic Ocean. It suggests a Silk Road of the sea, a trade route that operated thousands of years before the Age of Discovery. The Egyptians were not the only ones. The Phoenicians were the master shipbuilders of the ancient world.
They were the only ones brave enough to sail past the Pillars of Hercules into the Great Green Sea. In the 18th century, a stone was found in Paraíba, Brazil, the Paraíba stone. It was covered in a script that no one in Brazil could read. It was eventually identified as Phoenician. It told a harrowing story. We are sons of Canaan from Sidon, the city of the king. It describes a fleet of 10 ships that sailed around Africa. A storm separated one ship from the rest. It was carried by the currents to a distant land, a land of iron and strange birds. For years, the stone was called a forgery, but linguistic analysis in the 1960s revealed something startling. The stone used Phoenician idioms and grammatical quirks that were unknown in the 18th century. The person who found the stone couldn't have faked it. They didn't know enough about the language. Think about the implications. If the Phoenicians reached Brazil and the Egyptians were using American plants, then the ancient world was not a collection of isolated islands. It was a global economy, a web of trade that stretched from the Nile to the Amazon. Why did it stop? History is full of collapses. The fall of Rome, the Bronze Age collapse. When the great empires died, the trade routes died with them. The maps were lost. The knowledge of the land of the West became a myth. It became the Atlantis of Plato. It became the Avalon of the Celts. It turned from a geographical fact into a campfire legend. Columbus didn't discover a new world. He rediscovered an old one. He was a man holding a faded map of a world that had once been united. A world that had been trading gold for tobacco and silk for coca, while the rest of the world was still learning to sail. The mummies are not just bodies, they are witnesses, and they are telling us that the ocean was never a barrier. It was always an invitation.
The African faces in the jungle and the spheres of the gods. We have looked at the chemicals in the blood. Now we must look at the faces in the stone. Deep in the humid jungles of Mexico lies the heart of the Olmec civilization. They were the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They built pyramids and complex calendars long before the Aztecs or Mayans. But in 1862, a farm worker found something that defied all logic: a colossal stone head, carved from a single block of volcanic basalt. It weighed 20 tons, and it did not look like the local people. The face had broad features, full lips, a flat nose. It wore a helmet that looked remarkably similar to the battle gear of ancient African warriors. Since then, 17 of these heads have been found. They are not portraits of Europeans. They are not portraits of Asians. To any objective eye, they are portraits of West Africans. Mainstream archaeologists call this a coincidence. They say the features are just a stylistic choice of the carvers. But why choose a style that looks exactly like a people from across the sea? Why carve these faces with such detail and reverence if those faces had never walked the shores of Mexico? Let us move south to the rainforests of Costa Rica. Here we find the Decus spheres, over 300 stone balls. Some are just a few centimeters wide, others are 2 meters tall and weigh 15 tons. They are perfectly round, mathematically precise. They were carved from solid granodiorite. How were they made without metal tools? How were they moved through the dense jungle? But the real mystery is their placement. They were found in clusters, arranged in lines and triangles. When researchers mapped their positions, they found they were aligned with celestial events, and some pointed directly across the Atlantic, toward the Pillars of Hercules, toward the home of the Phoenicians. Think about the Olmec heads and the Decus spheres together. They represent a technology and a connection we don't want to admit.
If Africans reached the Gulf of Mexico, they didn't come as slaves. They came as kings. They came as gods. The Olmecs revered these figures. They gave them the most prominent places in their cities. In the 1970s, a researcher named Ivan van Sertima presented a revolutionary idea. He pointed to the Nubian style of the Olmec helmets. He pointed to the skeletal remains found in Olmec graves, bones that showed the cranial structures of African people. He was ignored by the Academy, because to admit that Africans discovered America is to admit that the Old World was never superior to the New. There is a fear in history, a fear of the unknown sailor. If we admit the Romans were in Brazil, if we admit the Egyptians were in the Grand Canyon, if we admit the Africans were in Mexico, then the story of progress falls apart. We realize that humanity was more connected 5,000 years ago than we were 500 years ago. The Olmec heads are watching us. They have been sitting in the jungle for 3,000 years, waiting for us to recognize their faces, waiting for us to admit that the ocean was never a cage, it was a mirror. And when we look into it, we see a history that is much darker, much older, and much more beautiful than the books allow.
The Burroughs Cave and a Library of the Lost. We have looked at the stone heads in the jungle. Now we must go into the dark, to a place where the earth itself holds a library of forbidden truth. The year is 1982. In a remote corner of southern Illinois, a man named Russell Burroughs is out hunting for arrowheads. He falls through a hole in the ground. He finds himself in a cave system that should not exist. Inside, he describes seeing a sight that would change his life and destroy his reputation. Massive stone sarcophagi, gold-plated statues, and thousands of black siltstone tablets. These tablets were covered in carvings. They depicted maps of the ancient world. They depicted men in Roman armor, men in Hebrew robes, men in Egyptian headdresses. The scripts were a mix of Phoenician, Greek, and ancient Libyan. Russell Burroughs claimed there were thousands of these artifacts. He brought some of them out to the world. The reaction from the academic world was swift and brutal. Fake, hoax, fraud. They said no one could have carved that many tablets. They said the mixture of cultures in one cave was a historical impossibility. But let us look closer at the Michigan relics, a similar discovery made decades earlier. Thousands of objects found in burial mounds across Michigan, Coptic crosses, Egyptian-style tablets, a slate showing the Tower of Babel. Mormons, Catholics, and skeptics all fought over them. The experts claimed they were all forged by a single man. But how does one man forge 10,000 unique artifacts? How does he find the time to bury them in hundreds of different mounds across an entire state? And why? If it was for money, he never sold them. If it was for fame, he died in poverty. There is a pattern here. Every time a discovery is made that suggests a multicultural America, it is buried under the label of a hoax. Think about the implications of Burroughs Cave. If it is real, it is a refugee camp of the ancient world, a place where people from the dying empires of the Mediterranean fled. Perhaps they were running from the Roman legions. Perhaps they were the survivors of the fall of Jerusalem. They sailed west. They followed the currents of the Atlantic. They entered the Gulf of Mexico. They sailed up the Mississippi River, and they hid their history in a cave in Illinois. They left their stories on stone because they knew the paper would rot. They wanted us to know they were here. They wanted us to know that the New World was their last hope. In the 1990s, a team of researchers analyzed the gold from some of the Burroughs artifacts. They found it was not modern gold. It was not plated using modern techniques. And the stones?
The weathering of the carvings suggested they had been in a damp cave for centuries, yet the site has never been professionally excavated. The entrance has been dynamited shut. The location is now a secret, because the truth inside those tunnels would not just edit our history books, it would set them on fire. It would prove that America was a melting pot 2,000 years before the Statue of Liberty was built. We are told that the oceans were walls, but for those running for their lives, the ocean was a door. The Library of the Lost in Illinois is a testament to human desperation and human courage. It tells us that the world has always been small, that we have always been connected by our fear, our hope, and our hunger for a new start. Columbus wasn't the first person to seek a new life in the West. He was just the one who had a government to back him up. The people in the cave had no one, except the stones they left behind.
We have seen the libraries of the lost in the caves of Illinois. Now we must step out into the blistering sun of New Mexico, to a place called Hidden Mountain. In 1933, a professor from the University of New Mexico was led to a massive basalt boulder. It was tilted at an angle, and its flat face was covered in a strange ancient script. It is known today as the Los Lunas Decalogue Stone. The script is not Spanish, it is not Native American, it is Paleo-Hebrew, a form of the Hebrew alphabet used over 2,000 years ago. When experts translated the stone, their hearts skipped a beat. It was an abridged version of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The carvings were crisp. The grammar was perfect for the era of the First Temple. Critics claimed it was a hoax created by bored university students. But there is a problem with the hoax theory. The stone was first reported in the 1880s by a local resident. At that time, Paleo-Hebrew was almost entirely unknown to the public. Even the most brilliant scholars of that century were only just beginning to decipher it. How could a prankster in the New Mexico desert in 1880 carve a language that the world's greatest linguists were still trying to understand? But the trail of the Hebrews doesn't stop in the desert. It moves east to the green hills of Tennessee. The year is 1889. An archaeological team from the Smithsonian is excavating a burial mound, the Bat Creek Mound. Inside, they find 9 skeletons, and under the skull of the lead skeleton, they find a small stone, the Bat Creek inscription. At the time, the Smithsonian officials thought it was Cherokee. They printed the image in their official report, but they printed it upside down. For nearly a century, the stone sat in a drawer, ignored. Then, in the 1970s, a scholar named Henriette Mertz flipped the photo. Suddenly, it wasn't Cherokee, it was Hebrew. The inscription read, "For the Judeans," or "A comet for the Judeans." The style of the letters matched the coins minted during the Jewish revolt against Rome around 130 AD. The skeletons were carbon dated. They were nearly 2,000 years old. These were not modern forgeries planted by pranksters. These were people who lived, fought, and died in Tennessee while the Roman Empire was still at its height. How did they get here? The lost tribes of Israel has been a legend for millennia, but history is starting to show that they weren't lost. They were traveling. When Jerusalem fell to the Romans in 70 AD, thousands of people fled into the Mediterranean. Some went to Africa, some went to Europe. But perhaps the bravest among them boarded Phoenician ships. They crossed the Pillars of Hercules. They caught the trade winds. They sought a promised land where no Roman legion could ever find them. They left their commandments in the stones of New Mexico. They buried their dead with their sacred language in Tennessee. They were refugees of a forgotten war, and America was their sanctuary. We look at the history of religion in America, and we think of the Puritans. We think of the 1600s. But the Decalogue Stone and the Bat Creek inscription suggest that the God of the Old Testament was being worshipped in the American wilderness 1,500 years before the Mayflower. The stones are not just artifacts, they are prayers.
and they are proof that the map of the ancient world was far more complex than we ever dared to dream.
The Grand Canyon Citadel and the Star Maps. We have seen the Hebrew prayers in the desert and the hills, but now we must return to where we began, to the deepest, most shadowed cracks of the Grand Canyon. We must revisit the story of G.E. Kincaid and the Egyptian citadel. If you look at a map of the Grand Canyon today, you will see names that feel strangely out of place in the American West: the Tower of Set, the Temple of Osiris, the Horus Temple, the Isis Temple, the Cheops Pyramid. The official story is that early map makers were simply inspired by the majestic shapes. They called them temples because they looked like temples. But what if the names came first? What if the explorers found something that forced them to use those names? In the 1909 Gazette report, Kincaid claimed the cavern was nearly impossible to reach. It was located 2,000 feet above the riverbed. Inside, he found a cross-shaped hall. He found a central shrine with a statue of a god sitting cross-legged, holding a lotus flower in each hand. He found a mummy crypt that could hold hundreds of bodies. But here is the detail that haunts the researchers. The mummies were all male, and they were all wrapped in a specific way, a way that matches the pre-dynastic era of Egypt, before the pharaohs built the Great Pyramids of Giza. If Kincaid was lying, he was a master of archaeology. He described artifacts that the public wouldn't understand for another 50 years. He spoke of hieroglyphics that were not quite Egyptian, but a hybrid of Oriental and African styles. Now look at the stars. The ancient civilizations of the Americas were obsessed with the sky. The pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico are aligned with the belt of Orion. The Hopewell Mounds in Ohio track the 18.6-year cycle of the moon. But there is a connection that spans the ocean. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt and the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan have the exact same base perimeter. They were built with the same mathematical ratio of pi. The engineers on both sides of the Atlantic were using the same cosmic blueprint. How do two cultures, separated by an ocean they supposedly couldn't cross, build monuments with the same mathematical signature? It suggests a high science that was shared by a global network of priests, a network that saw the earth not as a collection of countries, but as a mirror of the heavens. But why hide it? If there was an Egyptian colony in the Grand Canyon, if there was a global brotherhood of star watchers, why did it vanish? The answer may lie in the Great Catastrophe. Geologists have found evidence of a massive solar event, or perhaps a comet strike, around 12,000 years ago. It caused the sea levels to rise by 400 feet. It wiped out the coastal cities. It turned the high civilizations into ghost civilizations. The survivors fled to the mountains. They fled into the caves. They became the mound builders and the cliff dwellers. They held on to the memories of the stars. They carved the maps into the stone. And then they died out, leaving only the names on the map and the whispers in the canyon. The Smithsonian Institution says the Kincaid story is a myth. They say they have no records of any such cave. Yet the area remains a no-fly zone. Hikers who get too close are turned back by armed rangers. The ground is unstable, they say, or perhaps the ground is too revealing. History is written by the victors, but the victors are often the ones who arrived last. They find the ruins, they rename the temples, and they tell us that before they arrived, there was only the wind.
The blood never lies. The DNA revolution. We have looked at the stones. We have looked at the maps. We have looked at the temples in the canyons. But for a century, the skeptics had one final defense.
If they were here, they said, where is the evidence in the people? They claimed that the indigenous people of America were a single, isolated group, locked away from the world for 10,000 years. But science has finally caught up to the legends, and the code is written in our blood. The DNA revolution has arrived, and it is tearing the old history books to shreds. Let us look at the X haplogroup. In the world of genetics, a haplogroup is like a biological signature. It tells us where your ancestors came from thousands of years ago. Most Native American DNA is haplogroup A, B, C, or D. These point directly to Siberia and East Asia. But there is a fifth group, haplogroup X. It is found in high concentrations among the Ojibwe and Algonquian tribes of the Great Lakes. And here is the mystery. Haplogroup X does not exist in Siberia. It does not exist in East Asia. Its heartland is the Middle East and the Mediterranean. It is the DNA of the Phoenicians, the DNA of the ancient Druids of Europe, the DNA of the people of the Nile. How did Middle Eastern DNA end up in the heart of the American wilderness thousands of years before the first European ship was supposed to arrive? It wasn't a mistake in the lab. It was a migration, a direct link between the copper mines of Lake Superior and the Bronze Age civilizations of the Old World. The X group didn't walk across a land bridge. They sailed. They brought their genes, their ironworking skills, and their star knowledge with them. They intermarried. They became part of the American story. The Indian was never just one people. The Americas were a melting pot long before the word was invented. But the blood speaks elsewhere, too. In the Amazon rainforest, scientists found a ghost population, Population Y. They tested the DNA of the Aleutian Islanders and the tribes of Brazil. They expected to find Asian markers. Instead, they found a genetic match for the Australasians, the indigenous people of Australia and Papua New Guinea. These people are separated by the widest part of the Pacific Ocean, 10,000 miles of deep water. This is not a land bridge story. This is a great navigation story. It means that while the Ice Age was still freezing the north, ancient mariners from the southern hemisphere were island hopping. They were crossing the abyss in canoes. They were seeding the rainforests of South America with a lineage that predates the Mayans. And then there are the Lucia remains, a skull found in a cave in Brazil, 11,500 years old. When forensic artists reconstructed the face, it didn't look like a Mongoloid or an East Asian. It looked African. It looked aboriginal. The oldest face in South America is a face that science cannot explain without admitting that the ocean was never a wall. We have been lied to because it is easier to manage a simple history. It is easier to tell a story of discovery than a story of convergence. But the DNA is a witness that cannot be intimidated. It tells us that we are a global family, that the ancient world was a hive of movement. The Vikings brought their blue eyes to the north. The Polynesians brought their strength to the west. The Phoenicians brought their symbols to the east. And the Africans brought their royalty to the south. America was never found. It was the place where all the rivers of humanity finally met. And the blood in our veins is the map that proves it.
The final awakening, the mirror of time. We have reached the end of the trail, from the iron nails of the Vikings to the sweet potatoes of the Pacific, from the Egyptian mummies to the Hebrew stones in the desert. The evidence is no longer a collection of anomalies. It is a mountain of truth. And yet, the statues of Columbus still stand. The textbooks still begin the clock in 1492. Why?
Because history is not just about what happened. History is about power. If you admit that the land was already found, if you admit that it was already built, mapped, and traded, then the word discovery becomes a lie, and the word conquest becomes the truth. For 500 years, we have lived in a story of the first to cross, the first to civilize, the first to own. But the Earth has a much longer memory than we do. The Earth remembers the 23,000-year-old footprints of a mother in New Mexico. The Earth remembers the sound of African drums in the Gulf of Mexico. The Earth remembers the prayers of the Templars in the forests of the North. America was never a new world. It was an ancient world. It was a sanctuary for the refugee, a laboratory for the astronomer, a marketplace for the sailor. It was the final destination for every brave soul who dared to look at the horizon and say, "There is something more." We are living in an age of unlearning. The digital world is opening the vaults of the past. The DNA is speaking. The satellites are finding cities buried under the jungle. The great American lie is finally crumbling. But what takes its place is something much more beautiful. A story of a humanity that was never truly divided. A story of a planet where the oceans were not barriers, but bridges. We were never alone. We were never lost. We were always moving toward each other. Christopher Columbus did not change the world because he found America. He changed the world because he was the last person to find it. He brought the end of the age of mystery and the beginning of the age of borders. But today, we can choose to look past the borders. We can choose to see the star paths of the Polynesians. We can choose to honor the iron of the Norse. We can choose to hear the Hebrew in the desert. Discovery is not an event. Discovery is a state of mind. It is the courage to look at the old stories and ask, is this all? The truth is out there, in the dust of the canyon, in the blood of the people, and in the silence of the great, limitless sea. The world was never flat, and the story of America is just beginning.